First up, a short clip from the Space Shuttle, supposedly from 1990. 190 miles up, travelling 18,000 miles an hour, looking at the Earth. A view these guys got very familiar with, apparently.
And this is the kind of view you have from the orbit that we finally got to, about 190 miles above the Earth, traveling about 18,000 miles an hour. In fact, that's pretty much the way we saw it for most of the time we were up there. There was a...
So that's the view from the Space Orbiter Shuttle from 190 miles up when you're doing 18,000 miles an hour. Okay? This is James May in a U-2 spy plane at an altitude of 70,000 feet, as opposed to 190 miles up, like the Space Shuttle footage we saw just now. So let's see James be blown away by the Earth curve.
There it is, 70,000 feet. This is madness. Is there anybody else up here? Presumably not. Yes! Oh man, I've got that curvature of the horizon thing.
Amazing, James. Looks very familiar. Looks almost the same as the Space Shuttle from back in the day. I wonder what happens if we compare the two here. Bear with me. So I blended the image from James being blown away by supposedly seeing curve at 70,000 feet out of his window here. And I blended the image of supposed curve from 190 miles up from the Space Shuttle. Let's see how they work out as far as comparing them to each other. James May, U-2, spy plane, Space Shuttle. Strange. U-2 spy plane, Space Shuttle. Exactly the same. So it would seem the U-2 spy plane and the curvature that James May saw out the window at 70,000 feet, bizarrely enough, is having or seeing exactly the same amount of curvature the lads in the Space Shuttle saw 190 miles up, as opposed to, what's the U-2, about 13 miles up. So 177 miles higher up, you see the same amount of curve. Strange. And what makes it even stranger is the fact when we go to NASA's website, we find they've actually got U-2 spy planes themselves, and have done since the early 70s. So not only have NASA's Space Shuttle provided footage that looks exactly the same as the U-2 spy plane that James May flew in and showed the same amount of curvature, it turns out that NASA actually have the same spy planes themselves. Who would have thought? Let's just come down. NASA Armstrong Fact Sheet ER2, which essentially is the newer name for the upgraded version of the U-2. Slightly different airframe, slightly longer wings, but of course it's based off the original model. We come down. Program history. NASA acquired its first ER2 aircraft in 81 and a second in 89. They replaced the two Lockheed U-2 aircraft which NASA had used to collect science data since 1971. Now this is really strange because the U-2 aircraft was meant to have been phased out and retired in the 1960s. 1966 the SR-71 came into service, and by the end of the 60s the U-2 plane was thought to have been totally retired, partly because of satellites and partly because of the SR-71. Strange that in 71 NASA would acquire two old spy planes, considering 2 years earlier they supposedly had men on the moon. Doesn't make any sense. NASA have sent men onto the moon driving about in buggies playing golf, and then a few years later they acquire old spy planes that should have retired several years earlier and have kept spy planes ever since. Kind of gives the game away, don't you think? It would seem NASA bought those planes to provide high altitude footage which they were going to cite was coming from space. The fact we've compared those two images kind of highlights that. The timeline kind of highlights that. The fact this plane is still around really highlights the absurdity of all of this heliocentric space, satellites going round balls and all the nonsense. And what makes it even more obvious is the payload options available to this plane. Does all the things supposedly satellites do and more, whether it be weather, spying, crops, evaluating for farmers, whatever. It's rather obvious at this point in time. And in this instance, we're going to thank NASA and their timelines and their footage and the U-2 spy plane for making a mockery of the mainstream narrative. Thanks, guys.